The M1 Pro MacBook and M1 Max MacBook is Apple's second system on a chip designed for Macs, and it reflects Apple's switch away from Intel CPUs, which have been used in Macs since 2006. This video will assist you in determining which of these MacBooks is the ideal fit for you. To begin with, Apple's M1 chip launched in 2020 stunned many people with how much it enhanced performance in the 13-inch MacBook Pro M1, Mac Mini M1, and MacBook Air M1. In just under a year, Apple has announced two M1 successors, the M1 Pro and M1 Max MacBooks. The M1 Pro and M1 Max featured 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro models after their release in October 2021 as Apple's second-generation silicon chips. The M1 Pro and M1 Max chips promise a considerable performance gain over their predecessors. Both chips outperform the M1 in practically every way, with faster CPU performance and graphics capabilities, at least twice that of the M1. We will soon review the similarities and differences of the M1 Pro MacBook and M1 Max MacBook Pro. But before we do that, let's take a quick look into their features to have a fair understanding of their capacity. Starting with the M1 Pro, it is essential to state that Apple transitioned from Intel CPUs, which have been used in Macs since 2006, and the M1 Pro is Apple's second system on a chip developed for Macs. The M1 Pro has several components, including the CPU, GPU, Thunderbolt controller with USB 4 support, encode-decode engines, and more. It will surprise you to know that the CPU and GPU in the M1 Pro works exceptionally due to the system on chip, and we'll describe what a system on chip entails later in this video, so stick around to discover it. Officially, the M1 Pro features 10 CPU cores, with 2 efficiency cores and 8 high-performance cores. The 10-core M1 Pro features a 16-core GPU, whereas the 8-core M1 Pro features a 14-core GPU. Apple also included a media engine in the M1 Pro, which speeds up video processing. Moving forward, the M1 Max also has features such as GPU, CPU, Unified Memory Architecture, RAM, SSD controller, Neural Engine, Thunderbolt controller with USB 4 capability, and other components, which increases its performance. A 10-core CPU powers the M1 Max with 8 high-performance cores and 2 high-efficiency cores. The M1 Max is accessible in 2 versions, one with a 24-core GPU and a 32-core GPU. You'll be blown away by the amount of power the M1 Max encode and decode media engines provide the GPU to speed up graphic rendering. We'll talk about the encode and decode media engine soon, so stay connected. M1 Max can hold up to 64 GB of data, and it also has a memory bandwidth of up to 400 GB. Do you prefer a 24-core GPU or a 32-core GPU? Give this video a thumbs up if you found a preference between the 2 GPUs. In a quick thought on Twitter, an IT specialist, Steven Sadowski, said Apple's M1 Pro Max is the second step in a major change in computing. What might be seen as an evolution from iPhone ARM is really part of an Apple story that began in 1991 with PowerPC. And what a story of innovation! Comparatively, the M1 Pro MacBook and M1 Max MacBook share the same basic architecture based on the M1 microprocessor, and thus have identical core functionality. They both have a 10-core processor with 8 performance and 2 efficiency cores. They're also systems on chip, which means they're designed to maximize efficiency and minimize latency by combining the CPU and GPU and allowing them to share a single pool of unified RAM. Both Macs also have a 16-core Neural Engine and use 5nm processor technology. Do you know that at first glance, the M1 Max chip appears to be a faster and more powerful version of the M1 Pro, but appearances can be misleading. The two chips are very similar, so the M1 Max's greater power may not be worth the extra cost based on what you do with your MacBook Pro. Let us examine the differences between the M1 Pro versus M1 Max to affirm this statement. The M1 Pro and M1 Max MacBook GPUs are interesting if you care about graphics processing power for video editing or playing the latest games. The M1 Pro has up to a 16-core GPU. The M1 Max, on the other hand, stands out in this category since it comes with a 32-core GPU that Apple claims can give up to 4 times quicker graphics performance than the M1. It is not an exaggeration to say the M1 Max promises an unmatched graphical processing power. The chip in both models contains dedicated encode and decode media engines that help accelerate video work like rendering. However, the M1 Pro only has one of each, while the M1 Max includes one specialized decoding engine and 2 dedicated encoded engines, making video encoding substantially faster. Again, if you use numerous monitors, keep in mind that the M1 Pro only supports 2 external displays, but the M1 Max allows 4. Overall, the M1 Pro is a competent chip that is the best choice for most professional workloads. The M1 Max, on the other hand, is simply a more powerful version of the M1 Pro that is better suited to GPU processes that are particularly demanding. So based on the comparison of the M1 Pro MacBook versus M1 Max MacBook, we hope you've been able to identify which of these models you love best. If you settled on a favorite, let us know which of the 2 MacBooks you intend to buy in the comments section below. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.